better to redo a lab, or is it the same thing? If you just take the points for freeload.
Yeah, it's probably just take the points. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Yeah, so the camera and microphone are working, so I'm gonna go ahead and start recording. Oh, we are recording, excuse me. We are recording now. For PowerPoint. Batch. Real quickly. All right, we'll do attendance. 8:00, that's good timing. So, people physically here. Mankins and Mathis, right? Mankins, how about you next to this, right? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I remember seeing what you turned in last night now. Okay, here we go. Covington Griggs is here. Mathis is here. No one else is here. We're recording for the first time in weeks. As usual, we will do, I will do attendance words. As usual, you guys don't have to turn them in, but you can for extra credit. Maybe what happens is show up online, they'll need to turn them in for regular credit. And of course, if you're watching this video at a later date, you will need to turn them in addition to a screenshot every time I say one of the words. For example, the first word for attendance is going to be graduation. So when you are watching this video and then later you send me a bunch of screenshots, there should be a screenshot that shows this word graduation in a box. Granted, I'm not always going to put it in the box, but anyway, there we go. I'm not going to do announcements or reminders yet.
Question.
Yeah.
What do you mean by proof of registration or graduation?
I'll get back to you. I'm not going to do that yet. I'm going to wait because people like to come in late. So I'm going to do the announcements and reminders after the late people get here. So great question though. And I will explain it. All right, so this is where we left off. We were talking about trophic structure. We talked about food chains, which are very simple, right? You needed to know things like you've got your producer, followed by your primary consumer, followed by your secondary consumer, followed by your tertiary consumer, so on and so forth. I told you there's going to be at least one test question where I'll say, I'll give you a food chain of like, I don't know, the fish eats the plankton, the larger fish eats the smaller fish, the shark eats the larger fish. And I'll say, which one is the shark? Which one is the larger fish? Something like that. So I'll give you a food web and I'll ask you to tell me which one of them are, whether it be a producer, consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, so on and so forth. That's where we left off. Then we talked about biological magnification. There's probably not going to be any questions about that. It's a pretty simple concept. Basically, there's bad stuff in the water, right? Some of this stuff can't be digested. Digested is the wrong word. It can't be broken down, so it stays toxic. So that it's at the bottom of the food web or the food chain. It's a little bit of poison, but as you get higher and higher up the trophic levels, it gets more concentrated. Now, finally, that leads us to a more realistic situation. Biological magnification is realistic. I'm just saying food chains are not realistic. It's a very oversimplified way of looking at things. It's just really looking at the trophic structure. Food webs are different. Food webs actually show the relationship in a community woven into an elaborate food web, right? Because it's showing not just like this one species is the producer, and this one species eats that producer, and this one species eats that consumer, right? It's not that simple. There's no ecosystems where there's only one per trophic level. And that's what food webs are. Food webs show how they're actually woven into and they're more intricate. Which brings us to a new term that I haven't taught you yet, but I'm sure you already know what it is, and you do need to know what it is for the exam. Omnivore. So an autotroph is something that makes its own energy, right? Like a plant, right? Because of photosynthesis. That's an autotroph. Then we talked about an herbivore, or something that eats plants, right? We talked about a carnivore, something that eats other animals. An omnivore is something that eats both, basically. So here's an example.
Is it gonna be worded like that on the exam?
I don't remember. Good question. So for anybody on video, he's asking if it's going to be worded like that on the exam, where it says eat producers and consumers, like that. That whole point. I'm not sure. I don't remember. Which is a great point. So to remind you, whenever I say like on the exam, I might ask you for a definition. Just don't ever memorize the definition verbatim. Just make sure you understand what it means. Because I'll tell you what's definitely not going to be on the exams. I'm not going to try to trick you with it. So it's not like there's going to be some options that are like, that looks like it could be it, but he's twisting the word, so I'm not going to do that. All right. So here's an example. You can see this is much more complicated than the food webs we looked at. So here we have producers followed by primary consumers, then secondary consumers, and tertiary and quaternary. We have the same stuff, but now there's more than one species per trophic level, which is a lot more realistic. And not only that, and it's kind of hard to see this, but you can see it's not just like one thing eats one thing, right? It's all interwoven, especially when you start getting into omnivores, right? So you have some things maybe secondary consumers in this situation, but they also might be primary consumers, right? Or they might be tertiary consumers, depending on what the situation is. So you don't need to memorize anything here. The point here is that, a food web is a lot more realistic than a food chain. And it goes to show that it's not as simple as, everything. This species is always a primary consumer, and this species is always a secondary consumer, right? It doesn't work that way. I mean, think about humans, right? So when humans eat a salad, they are at that point a primary consumer. So when they eat a salad that has chicken on it, they're both a primary consumer and a secondary consumer. Or even a tertiary, depending on what the chicken was eating. If the chicken was eating nothing but bugs, which eat plants, now I put the human as a tertiary consumer. But anyway, this is, again, just an example, nothing to memorize there. Any questions about food webs? And this is stuff, again, I would assume you've probably grown up learning about. All right. Oh, yeah, one more thing, too. Sorry, that reminds me. This is another thing. Earlier in the week, I was talking about biodiversity and why it's so important. And this is, again, a very simplified version of a real ecosystem. But imagine, if you had a food chain and you took out the primary consumer, everything above it would be screwed, basically, right? But here, if you were to take out one of the primary consumers, everything's so interwoven that things might be okay, right? Things are gonna suffer, but it's not gonna be a total collapse because there's other things, there's other roles in the primary consumer, or excuse me, other species playing the primary consumer role. There's more than one species playing the secondary consumer role, right? So they have all these jobs to do, so to speak, if you want to think about it that way. So the more species you have, the more efficient the machine works. And the more it could stand to lose one species if there's a lot of species. So that's one of the importance of biodiversity, which is, again, the first thing we talked about in this chapter. That being said, let's go back to this idea of biodiversity. Specifically, remember there's two different types of biodiversity. We talked about genetic biodiversity, which is when you're looking at a single species and just basically looking at how deep its gene pool is. Then there was species diversity, right? And that was looking at the different number of species in a particular ecosystem or a particular community. And then we talked about ecosystem diversity. But now we're back here talking again about species diversity. So of the different types of biodiversity, that's what we're talking about right now, species diversity. As you already know from what we talked about previously, species diversity is the variety of species in a community, right? So right now in this room, I mean, as far as we can tell by looking, you would say the species diversity in this room is 1, right? Because there's humans and that's it. Of course, if you really get into it, there's a lot more than that because we all have different, different species of bacteria that live in our gut. You've got different species of arthropods living in your skin, in your face. I'm sure there's different species of mold in the air a little bit, right? The species diversity in this room is actually quite high, but we just can't see it. But anyway, that's what species diversity is. And there's 2 different ways of measuring it. There will be questions about this, at least one question. So know that to measure the species diversity in a community, you need to look at 2 things: species richness and the relative abundance. And you need to know what each one of those are. Species richness is the number of different species. So that's simple. That's what I just described, right? I said the way we look, when we look in this room, it looks like the species diversity is 1 because we have 1 species. Relative abundance is the proportional representation of each species. So let's say, for example, again, let's forget about the mold in the air and the bacteria in our guts and the bugs living in our skin. Let's pretend like it's just things you can see, right? So let's say we brought in 50 more humans, and then we brought in 1 dog and 1 cat. The species richness of this room would be 3, right? Because we'd have 3 different species. But the relative abundance, it wouldn't be very diverse when it comes to relative abundance. So yeah, there's 3 species, but it's almost all humans, right? Then you have like 1 human and 1 cat. So that's the difference between the 2. And the way the exam is going to go, it's going to say something like, you've been tasked with measuring the species diversity of this place. You know the number of different species that are there, so you need to know what else. And the answer would be relative abundance. Or I might say, you know the proportional representation of each species, so you need to know what else. And the answer would be species richness. So again, know the 2 things that you would need to measure species diversity, and know what they mean. So I'll give you an example before I take any questions. Here's woodland A versus woodland B. As far as species richness is concerned, they're all the same, right? There's, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 different species of trees up there. And here there's 1, 2, 3, 4 different species of plants, right? So of trees. So as far as species richness is concerned, both of these are equally diverse. Which one do you think is more diverse, woodland A or woodland B? Woodland B, good, right? Even though they have the same number of species, the relative abundance down here is a lot more equal. Anyway, the next word for attendance, and of course, if you're watching the video at a later date, you're going to take a screenshot, and I should be able to see these 2 woodlands, both of which have a red line under them. Anyway, the next word for attendance is Conan, like Conan O'Brien.
Like C-O-K.
Yeah, if you misspell it, it's okay. C-O-N-A-N. Yeah. You know what? I might use him as an attendance word from now on for the rest of it, so I don't have this job anymore. Maybe eventually he'll come visit us. If I keep doing that. Anyway, yeah. So here's a graph of what we're talking about. The woodland A is in kind of that beige pinkish color. Woodland B is in the blue color. So again, you can see woodland A is a lot more diverse because woodland B is a lot more diverse. Woodland A is almost entirely whatever type of tree that is. So again, that's species diversity. But here's where it gets a little bit more interesting. So this graph and this little discussion basically implies that having a bunch of different species in equal amounts is important, and it kind of is. But it also sort of implies that they're all equal, like all species are created equal. And that's not necessarily true. And that brings us to another concept that you need to know about. It's called keystone species. This is a species that has a much larger impact than its total biomass would indicate. So for example, I'm going to read those examples too, but what I'm saying here is like, if you look at an ecosystem and say, you just look at all these different species and you notice this one species, and it doesn't seem like there's a lot of them, it's just, small amount. But despite that small amount, sometimes they can be very, very important. And so here's some examples. This is from, I think,